Get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marina Agarwal, Vice Provost for Faculty at Georgetown University and Director of the Georgetown Center for Financial Markets and Policy. Today, we are delighted for our global virtual FinTech seminar series to have Professor Kose John from NYU's New York University Stern School. Kose is the Charles Gerstenberg Professor in Banking and Finance. As many of you already know, at the center, we've been hosting a couple of different kinds of events. We have our weekly FinTech seminar series, and then we're doing other events that are for the broader audience. Earlier this week, John Jacobs, the executive director of the center, he organized a session on ETFs, ETF performance from the flash crash to COVID-19, which was extremely popular. Earlier, we held another event on the markets have been dropped. Where are they headed? And the panelists were really interesting people, and they included the president of Fidelity Personal Investing and a speaker from CNBC's Fast Money. And it was just fascinating to hear their thoughts on where the markets are headed. Okay. These recordings are available on our website, so I invite you to learn more about the Center for Financial Markets and Policy by visiting our website, and also you can follow our Twitter handle at GUFinPolicy. Okay. We really are most grateful to our sponsors and partners that help the center in many different ways. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And Kose will take questions at the end of the seminar. And please, again, as usual, feel free to raise your hand or use the chat. And Alberto Rassi, the Associate Director for the Center, will moderate the Q&A session. Kose, with that, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Rina. I'm delighted to be included in this wonderful series. So I'm going to present a paper on the blockchain. This is the joint work with Franz Hinzen, who is an excellent doctoral student at NYU Stern in the finance department. Franz is going to be in the job market in a couple of years. He's going to be great, so keep tabs on him. Fahad Saleh, also an outstanding doctoral student from NYU Stern. David Yermak and I were advising his thesis. Fahad has a really nice paper on the proof of stake protocols. This was his job market paper, and the paper is doing very well. As David mentioned, it's doing very well at the RFS. Okay, so it's been 10, 11 years since Bitcoin came on the scene. Nakamoto released his white paper on the Bitcoin system with a capital B. And he had this vision that Bitcoin, with a small b, the currency, would in fact be widely adopted, decentralized global currency, and so on. But the reality is, yes, there is a lot of familiarity for it, but it has not been that widely adopted. In fact, I would say it is relatively sparsely adopted. So a natural question is, well, is it the case that Bitcoin is in its youth, give it more time? Or is it the case that there are some structural features of Bitcoin which is keeping it from being widely adopted? Okay, so we wanted to analyze that formally, look at it, and the conclusion that we come to in this paper, if there is a takeaway for this paper, That's what we have on the third line in quotes. We actually demonstrate that the economics of Bitcoin make limited adoption an inescapable equilibrium outcome. Yeah, so that's what we are finding. And we think it's very important because, Bitcoin in many ways is the benchmark. There are lots of innovations and adaptations and all that, but Bitcoin remains the most familiar benchmark against which, various alternatives are compared to. So we think it's very important to understand it very well. And if there are some flaws, we need to study it very well. So our results literally apply to proof of work payments blockchains. So some of the results do not apply to the overall blockchain system, but this is, as I said, the heart of it, and this is what we're going to analyze. Okay, let me give you, this is like telling you who the murderer is in a detective story. So let me give you a 3-word summary of what is going on in this paper. So we basically have negative network effects. This might be, of course, somewhat surprising to many people because we know that in payment systems, we actually expect positive network effects. In other words, when the network expands, payments are more efficient. You might get higher utility from the expanded network and so on and so forth. But we're going to show you that here in this setting, you actually have negative network effects. So that's behind its limited adoption. Okay, now to tell you a little bit more, I need to do a little setup, a little bit of the blockchain structure. So as we all know, the blockchain is an electronic ledger. Transactions are recorded in discrete chunks called blocks, and these blocks are chained together in a near chronological order. Okay, so the order is very important. Okay, now one more feature which turns out to be central is that this is a distributed system. That is, there is a network of agents referred to as miners, and each miner actually stores a copy of the ledger. So it's a unique ledger, but different nodes in the network maintain a copy of the ledger. The miners update the ledger by adding blocks and so on. Okay. Now, it's a one ledger, multiple copies. So an important feature of the blockchain is what I may call distributed consensus. So that is, there is a consensus all through the network. The network must agree on the ledger contents. So this consensus is an important feature. It's a central feature of the blockchain. Okay. Now, what we're going to study is an important friction, which we're going to call it network delay. That is, communicating information across the network takes time. So there is maybe a small, but it takes time. And we're going to call it network delay. Okay. And we're going to study that seriously. And what we're going to show you is that network delay combined with this requirement for consensus, the need for consensus on the blockchain, that is what is going to create the negative network effects. Okay, so I told you, I peeled off one more layer of the onion. So we're going to show you that there is negative network effects, and it's actually coming from taking seriously network delay, of course, in a system which does require consensus. Okay, so that's a central feature of the blockchain, and we are saying, so together, it's going to create negative network effects, and hence limited adoption. So that's where we are going with it. Okay, let me tell you a little bit more about the features of Bitcoin. So, you know, I would say we single out 3 features that are important features of the Bitcoin, and it generates this limited adoption. Okay, so I already mentioned the need for consensus, that is, the need for agreement on the ledger content. So that is an important requirement of the blockchain. Now, you also have heard it's a permissionless network. So the blockchain is a permissionless network. That is, anybody who wants to be part of the network doesn't need any special permissions, can join the network. Okay, so and that's an important feature of this of the blockchain. So it's a permissionless network, and we are also going to have free entry condition. That is, you only join the network if it is in your interest to do so. Okay, so it's like similar to the free entry condition we use in economics. All right. Now there is also, this is sort of a specific feature, there is also a supply constraint on the blockchain. That is, you have blocks arriving one every 10 minutes. Okay, so there is, this is sort of, the system is set up such that there is a supply constraint on the blockchain. Okay, we're going to talk about it. We are also going to see what happens if we relax it, and so on. Okay, so it's a part of the blockchain, and it's an important part because this supply constraint. So let's look at the dynamics of what will happen, and then we're going towards now. Where is this limited adoption problem coming up? Okay, so let's say there are all these users on the blockchain network who are trying to get their transactions processed on the blockchain. Let's say there is a positive demand shock on the blockchain. So suddenly a bunch of users come on the blockchain trying to get their transactions processed. Now, remember, we have this supply constraint. Okay, so we all know supply is constrained. There is a positive shock in demand, in this case, demand for transactions. So what would happen, of course, there would be a price response. That is, the price that users pay to the miners, that's called transaction fees. Transaction fees would go up, basically, right? Supply is constrained, there is an increased demand, and the transaction fee goes up. Now, transaction fee is a profits for the miners. So when the transaction fee goes up, that would, through the free entry condition, that would make more miners join the network. So in other words, the transaction fee increases the network size. Okay, so it expands the network. Now don't forget the network delay. So in this case, you are maintaining the supply constraint. The network size has increased. So basically, what will happen is you still have the consensus requirement. So with the expanded network, what is going to happen is communication across the network takes longer. In other words, the consensus process is prolonged, and basically the waiting time for the would-be transactors is larger. And so we are saying the waiting time goes up, and that in fact makes these transactions on the blockchain less attractive for the would-be transactors, and that leads to limited adoption. There is more to the story, but at this point, just at a very basic level, we have a blockchain where everybody is behaving well. So we have this network delay, and that is in fact going to lead to, so right now we have the supply constraint. So that is going to lead to very prolonged waiting times. And this is, of course, something we show in the model formally, and then leading to limited adoption. Okay. Now some of you are thinking, and I would be too if I was listening to this, how would you deal with the situation in the real world? Okay. So in other words, think of, you're in a grocery store, you have long lines, you had a limited number of cashiers. So what would you do? You would add a few cashiers. You would try to increase the supply to meet the sort of excess demand. Okay, so why don't we do something like that in the Bitcoin setting? So in other words, we have this supply constraint, which is somewhat artificial if you think about it. So why don't we increase the supply? Why don't we speed up the arrival rate of the blocks? Okay, so in other words, it's like now, while in the grocery store situation, adding these cashiers solves the problem, lo and behold, in the Bitcoin setting, it does not. So why is that? This is important. So what happens is, in the grocery store setting, each cashier is working in a silo. He keeps the nose to the ground and in an expeditious manner processes these customers, right? That's what happens. In the Bitcoin setting, there is a difference. Remember the distributed consensus requirement. In the Bitcoin setting, the cashiers, they not only have to process the customers, they also have to think about arriving at consensus in the network. So in other words, these cashiers, while they're busily processing the customers, they also have to communicate that information to the other cashiers, to the network of cashiers. Now, you can imagine, so that's a network delay coming in. So here, basically, they have to communicate the information to the point that all the cashiers are agreed on a unique order in which the customers were processed. Okay, you can imagine that would throw a wrench into the works. That would really lead to very prolonged delays, and the whole purpose is defeated. So in other words, in the Bitcoin setting, even though you could increase the supply rate of these blocks arriving, there is a problem. So the problem is that in the presence of network delay, the requirement of consensus is messing up things, is creating big delays. And even with the expanded supply, you continue to have limited adoption. Okay, so this is again a little bit more explanation on what is going on. Okay, now there is a very interesting literature. We are going to use, I'm going to show you the theoretical model in a second. We're going to use a queuing theory model because that's the most natural model to use. Now, Maureen's paper in the JFE, Easley, O'Hara, and Basu, they also use a queuing theoretic model. So does Huberman, Leshno, and Moyelmi. These are great papers. Now, what we do additional is that we model network delays, and we model and the forking, which is going to result from that. Okay, so that's what we do, and that's what is behind the limited adoption results that we're going to get. People have looked at various Bitcoin alternatives beyond the proof of work systems. As I said, Fahad, in his thesis, had a very nice paper studying, I think he's the first to look at proof of stake systems in the finance and economics literature. In the computer science literature, they do that quite a bit. I have Silvio Michele's paper here. So this is a very interesting literature. Actually, I have a paper with Felix Irresberger and Fahad, where we look at the whole public blockchain ecosystem. So we study across various protocols, we study what's going on, and we try to analyze based on some key attributes which are pervasive to the blockchain systems. There's a related literature on smart contracts. Song and He has this nice paper. Tokenomics has become a big area, number of interesting papers. Okay, let me walk you through the model quickly. So the model, we model the users. They want their transactions to be processed on the blockchain. And of course, the miners who are actually doing the work. Now, we are focusing on the Bitcoin. We're focusing on Bitcoin. Now, if the users are not deriving sufficient utility transacting on Bitcoin, they're going to just walk away and they're going to use a traditional alternative. Okay, so the non-adoption option is represented by the traditional alternative. Of course, the action is we want to know whether or not the users would transact on the Bitcoin. Okay, the utility function of the user, it has three terms. The first term is R, which is the measure of utility that they get if they're able to transact on Bitcoin. The second term is very important. So the second term is the expected waiting time multiplied by CI, which is the degree of intolerance for waiting of user I. Okay, so it's a parameter which represents the aversion to waiting of user I. So the users are heterogeneous with respect to this parameter, and this parameter is distributed uniformly on the 0-1 interval. Okay, so that's a CI. Now, the waiting time is an important term here. So the waiting time depends on the fees paid by user I, the fees which come out of the optimization on the first line, and of course the fees paid by everybody else, because the miners are going to pick up the fees in the descending order. So if you pay higher fees, you get priority execution. Remember the network delay. The network delay is also in the W function. So that's a waiting time. Okay, so that's going to play an important role in the model. Now, as I said, at its maximum, the utility of the user, if that is negative, that means the user is not getting sufficient utility. The user walks away and he executes the transaction on the credit card and gets a utility level which is standardized to be 0. Okay, so if they execute on the blockchain, only if the maximum level of utility that they can get is positive. Okay, so that's the non-negative, I should have said, but okay. All right, miners. A miner in our model is an individual processor. So all the processors. Miners process the transactions in the descending order of fees. So start as fees and go down. Mining sector is competitive, as I mentioned earlier. So you can see the condition, the only equation on the page is the free entry condition. Okay. So the numerator is the sum of all the fees they get from the system. And that is, of course, endogenous to our model. And miners come in as long as the marginal profit on the system is non-negative. So that's a free entry condition. Okay. Now, let me say a little bit about the proof of work blockchain. So what the miner has to do to get a block is to solve a trivial puzzle. So I'm going to say it's a trivial puzzle, not because it's an easy puzzle. It is because, you don't need any special brains to solve the puzzle. What you really do is you go through a process of exhaustive, excruciating enumeration. Try one by one all the alternatives until you find success. Okay, so you can think of it as mathematically it's equivalent to tossing a weighted coin where the probability of head is very, very small. Okay, so you keep doing it until you get a head. Okay, now you know that the Poisson limit theorem tells us that the success rate in such a system is distributed according to the Poisson distribution with a parameter lambda. Okay, so that's what we have. All right, now this is for a single miner. If you have multiple miners, the process is also approximately Poisson, where the independent Poisson processes sum to a Poisson process as well. So if you have multiple miners, if Fahad and I are mining, the block production rate on the blockchain is the sum of blocks produced by Fahad plus the sum of blocks produced by, the sum of block production by Fahad and block production by me. Okay. Now, unfortunately, though, this is not the case once we have network delay. So network delay is going to mess up things. So what is going to happen is, so let me go through a simple example. So let's say Fahad and I are miners on the blockchain, and let's say the network delay is 5 seconds. Okay, so we have a hefty block rate. So let's say in second number 2, I produce a block. I get a block. Okay, so I'm successful. I get a block in second number 2. Of course, I immediately try to communicate that information through the network. Now it takes 5 seconds to communicate. On the other hand, in 2 seconds, 2 more seconds, that is second number 4, Fahad gets a block. Okay. So now the network, so there are a couple of things. First of all, that's a fork. That's the starting of a fork. So because now the 2 blocks are not going to be consistent with each other. So they're going to be inconsistent. So this is because the proof of work puzzles are a function of the history. Okay. So in other words, Fahad doesn't know by the time he's claiming he has a block, he doesn't know that I have discovered a block because we are, it's within the network delay period. Okay. So in other words, we have a disagreement and we model the network delay, allowing for disagreement arising from it. So this is what we do, and that's an important part of the model. So let me give you a little bit more flavor. So remember, delta I is going to be the time taken to communicate one transaction to node I. Okay, so it's a network delay for minor I. Now, delta is the rate at which an ASIC finds puzzle solutions. So lambda is remember the arrival rate, the Poisson arrival rate. So these are the parameters. What we're going to do is to look at what happens to the probability of agreement on the block. So remember, the consensus process has to take place until there is agreement. So what are the impediments to agreement? That's where we're going with this. So you can compute the probability of agreement on the block. It depends on 2 things. It depends on the network delay. Okay, so the average network delay, so you see on the last but one line, the average network delay is capital delta, and the blockchain transaction rate is lambda times number of transactions times the number of miners. That is capital lambda. Okay, so capital lambda, capital delta, big players in that probability of agreement on a block. And what is interesting here, the probability of agreement is going down when you increase the network delay, which is our delta, and the block transaction rate of capital lambda. So in other words, both of these things, remember in the example with Fahad and me, I told you the fact that we have this network delay is creating disagreements and prolonged consensus time. And that would be worse if the network delay is 10 seconds instead of 5 seconds. Okay. Similarly, if the rate at which blocks are being discovered, that rate is high, again, that is cause for, remember Fahad found a block in 2 seconds. It's a cause for disagreement between us. So this is what is going on. Okay, so the probability of agreement is going down in both the network delay and the blockchain transaction rate. All right. Let me not spend too much time here. So we model the network delay in a fairly general fashion. The first condition, so let me just quickly tell you, consistent with the literature, there is a big literature here. You can see if there is only one node in the network, it's like the only communication you have to do is talking to yourself. If that takes time, that person has to see my therapist. So here we assume talking to yourself takes no time. Of course, if it's a huge, big network, it takes, time is diverging. And for the kind of network we have, for example, random topology network, we are assuming that each additional miner increases the network delay. Okay, so this is a fairly standard in this setting, and it's consistent with the literature. Okay, we come to the equilibrium. Equilibrium conditions are natural conditions. Remember, the users transact on the blockchain only if you get positive utility from that. And we're going to characterize the users who are transacting on the blockchain as the interval from 0 to C star, a cutoff. The last marginal user on the blockchain is C star, yeah? So remember, all the users are distributed on the 0-1 interval. And what we are saying is only people who are not that tolerant of waiting, that is from C0 to C star, they're going to transact on the blockchain, okay? Now, the user's optimization that we already saw in determining the fees. So they have to pay the fees if they want to adopt, if they want to play on the blockchain. Otherwise, of course, they walk away, they don't pay any fees. And the last condition is simply the free entry condition. Okay. What we show is that there exists an equilibrium, and in a class of equilibria, that is in a class of phi functions which are differentiable and increasing in the weight disutility, the equilibrium that we find is actually unique. Okay, so this is this class of functions, fairly well-behaved class. It's been studied, for example, in Huberman's paper. So we show the existence of the equilibrium and that the equilibrium is unique in this class. Okay, now our main result is the result of limited adoption. So imagine, there is a large N, there is a large number of would-be transactors on the blockchain. So N is diverging. Now, so we are speeding up the blockchain transaction rate. Remember, that is capital lambda. So what happens? Well, what we show is that you might remember we have problems with the probability of agreement. Remember the term which was going down exponentially in both the network delay and capital lambda. So basically what we can show is that as N diverges, the interval of adopters, the interval from 0 to C star, that interval is shrinking to have zero width, basically. The C star going to 0 means the interval 0 to C star is shrinking. Basically, our characterization of limited adoption, okay? So what we are finding is, as demand increases, what happens is the interval of adopters is actually going to 0, okay? That's our limited adoption result. That's our main result. Now, let me give you a little bit of intuition of what really goes on. You remember, what is going on is, remember the utility function of the users, when the wait time gets prohibitive, okay, for the fees, optimally paid fees, if the wait time gets prohibitive and overtakes the R, the utility of transacting on the blockchain, the user walks away. If the wait time is prohibitive, the utility goes negative and the user walks away, does it on the credit card. Okay, so let's look at the wait time. This is the most important term here. So the wait time can be composed into two parts. One part I'm going to call a traditional wait time. That is the time it takes before we worry about network delays and consensus. And the second term is the expected consensus wait times, the wait time coming in from consensus problem. Okay, so let's look at the first term. The first term is, if you are, let's say, for the fees that you pay, you're number 10 in the queue, you have to wait until the 9 people ahead of you are processed. Okay, so that's a traditional wait time, and that wait time is, of course, declining in the rate, the transaction, the block transaction rate. Okay, so if you speed up the blocks, you can have the traditional processing rate goes up. So you get to the beginning of the queue faster. Okay, so that term goes down when you increase lambda, but expected consensus time, you remember that term is increasing in the delay time, which is delta, the network delay, and it is actually increasing in the block arrival rate, in the blockchain transaction rate. Okay, so in other words, even though it is also divided by capital lambda, the term is driven by the numerator, which is exponentially exploding. Okay, so the wait time explodes, leading to limited adoption. Now, quickly, counterfactually, if network delay is exactly 0, in other words, if there is absolutely no network delay, everything actually works out. There is a speedier processing. You can actually pay 0 fees in equilibrium, and there is, of course, rampant adoption. But our point is 0 network delay is the way to go. All right, that's not reality, basically. Okay, so limited adoption is endemic to Bitcoin. The traditional solution of expanding the supply rate does not work. More research is needed on the alternatives. As it turns out, I just finished a paper with Felix and Fahad on we are looking at the entire public blockchain ecosystem, various protocols. We are trying to analyze them systematically based on some key features. And let me recommend this paper. It's available on all our websites and on this tinyurl.com. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kose, for the great presentation. We have a couple of questions. The first one comes from Kirill Sharnov. Kirill, I'm going to unmute you now. You may speak.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, very well.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. But I have a question about mining pools. Like, it seems to me that if you allow possibility of mining pools, which would arise in equilibrium, if let's say mining are risk averse, then they would like to do risk sharing of the probability of getting the reward. So then this problem of delay due to consensus will go away.
Well,
because the only clusters which needs to agree, like only at the level of clusters, like clusters needs to agree across each other, but like single miner doesn't matter.
It's like thinking of a football team. Football team. They are a team. They work together, but they also need to communicate. They need to communicate optimally. So, in other words, you cannot take away the communication device from the captain. So we are saying that even mining pools, or even if you have, one person, a concentrated, miner with several processors, there is still some communication time involved. So we think network delay is still important. That's a kind of our take. There may be lower network delay, but we'll argue it's not 0. So that's what we'll say. Yeah.
No, but I thought you argued that the network delay effect, as size of the network growing, dominates the gains. This is the argument of the paper, and like it seems to me with mining pool, like it could be either way. So that the like standard gains from like increasing network would dominate the delay.
So yeah, so what we're saying is that okay, so to deal with the increased demand, okay, you're saying either the existing mining pools may put on more processors, or new miners may come on the network. So I agree. So if you're saying the first is what is going on, we are arguing that even in a pool there is communication involved, and so I'm saying the fact that there is more processors does increase network delay. That's what we would say. Yeah. So there may be ways of organizing it such that the increase in delay is smaller. So we concede that, but we are saying still there is some network delay, and that's going to create prolonged consensus time. So overall, so I think anyway. So that's our take on it.
Kose, can I just add, sorry, to your post tonight?
Yes.
So this is Fahad. I'm one of the.
Oh, Fahad, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So just to clarify, as Kose mentioned in the model setup, the miners are, when we say miners, we're talking about processors. So it's true that when you have a mining pool coordination. So for example, you coordinate on how you solve proof of work puzzle. So you won't have the same nonce tried by two different computers. But as Kose was, the point is those computers still have to communicate with each other. Now there are ways to sort of reduce how much the difficulty of communicating across the computers when they're owned by the same person. But that's why we model network delay very generally. It's still the fact that if I own two computers and one of them solves the problem, that first computer has to tell the second computer. So it's very important that we model, when we say miners, we're talking about processors. And then basically in the network delay trajectory, the functional form we have there, it'll basically affect the slope of that function at each point. And so it'll sort of help, but it won't resolve the problem. And that's just because, again, if you own two computers, they still have to talk to each other. When one solves a problem, it's not instantaneously transmitted to the other computers, even if the same person owns both the computers.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Next question comes from Jim Angel. Jim, you can talk.
Thank you. Kose, I think this is an excellent paper. I totally agree with your conclusion that Bitcoin as a payment system just really doesn't work very well, and for the reasons you point out. But when I engage with the Bitcoin fanatics, they'll admit, oh, you're not going to buy hamburgers with it, but they're fixated on this idea of Bitcoin as a store of value that the Fed can't water down, and they seem to believe that those electrons are worth something. And I was wondering if you might want to comment on that and how that could possibly affect the analysis when you enter a number of possible adopters for whom the transaction cost is actually of lesser importance.
Jim, that's a very interesting question. So yes, as a starting point, our analysis is targeted on the payment system, so in the sense, so that is our primary concern in this paper. And so that's that. And then what the phenomenon, I have another paper which I'm working on studying transaction fees and how that is affecting things, the system, in particular, how that is affecting the value of the transactions that actually end up on the blockchain, So in other words, you're right. So what we see in the data clearly is that the blockchain, the old Nakamoto's vision of here is a system on which we can do every transaction that is not the reality. In fact, the transactions are shifting. The transaction fees are going up. At the same time, the high value transactions are what you see on the system. So in other words, nobody is actually, I mean, our people doing the small transactions, that is actually going down substantially. The fraction is shifting way onto, you're right, high value transactions,
Yeah.
you know,
And
so
also,
that, yeah,
you know,
so it's a bit like, you know, transactions on which the transactor gets a large utility. So it's a bit like, you know, among our users, if you had heterogeneity as to the capital R, only the high valued transactions are going to happen on the blockchain. So you're right, there is a movement like that in the data.
right. And also when you add side chains like the Lightning Network, again, the fanatics go, oh, that's going to solve all those problems because we're just going to move to the Lightning Network. So I'm just, you know, again, curious as to, you know, how that would fit into your model.
So Fahad, do you want to add to our discussion going on here?
Sure. So let me just take the point about Lightning. So first, let me say that as you well know, there are lots of ideas out there in the space in the crypto space, and very many of them are not necessarily fully thought out. So Lightning at least has a white paper behind it, but it's not a particularly formal model and so on. So I think it's worthwhile to talk about some of the best ideas in that space, but you know, there are concerns with Lightning associated with things like if people are inattentive and so on. So, you know, I think it would certainly be interesting for people to kind of look into that. I should say in the context of the particular model, so in the spirit of like Maureen's paper in the JFE and Gour's paper that Kose mentioned too, the users are basically interacting in one shot. They show up and they disappear. And in the Lightning Network, if you have no repeated interaction, then there's really no value in it. So the unsatisfying answer is that it wouldn't do anything to the model because of the way the model is structured. But nonetheless, assuming that there aren't these other issues with the Lightning Network, like the inattention and so on, and that's taken care of, you know, it seems like it would be an interesting extension potentially.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Next question comes from Ming. Ming, I'm going to unmute you right now. You may speak now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so actually, I have a question. So I noticed that so in Bitcoin case, so if there are too many miners, so then the system will automatically reduce the difficulty of the puzzle, right? So then I don't know whether in your current setting you have already incorporated that assumption, because I think if the difficulty of the puzzle is reduced, for example, they just need to match less zeros than more zeros as before. So then this will also reduce the waiting time, right? So if this is also if this reduction of the difficulty level is also exponential, it may at least partially offset the exponentially increasing waiting time, right?
Yes, thank you, Ming. So yes, we fully consider that. So if you remember, I in my slides, I presented two cases. So the first case was where, exactly as you say, so the understanding was that the moment there are more miners and more hashing power, instantaneously the difficulty of the puzzle would be adjusted so that the block arrival rate is exactly the same. That's a case I first talked about. And then what happens is, yes, on purpose, exactly as you say, we are speeding up the block arrival rate by making the puzzle simpler, right? So so we do consider fully both cases. So the problem is in the second case, what I told you is that yes, the block arrival rate has been speeded up, but the successes that happen within the network delay period, you have the problem. See what I'm saying? That is so we do fully consider that. In fact, that's part of our solution. So in the main result, what we do have is that the block arrival rate has been speeded up, exactly by making the puzzle simpler. However, you still have the problem because the successes that happen within the network delay period has problems with achieving consensus. So that is, we do that. Thank you. Maybe I wasn't clear, but thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, I see. But I mean, but does that mean, but is that because the reduction of the difficulty of the puzzle is not enough? If you reduce the difficulty even, I mean, speed up or reduce the difficulty of the puzzle even more, even faster, make it comparable.
Right.
To...
So let me say this. This will be clear to you. Basically, when you speed up, so the difficulty, reducing the difficulty of the puzzle is just another way of saying we are speeding up the block arrival rate, right?
Yes.
When you speed up the block arrival rate, however, so remember in my slide, let me just, I don't know whether you can see that, but remember I have two terms. So in the first term, the traditional term, there is faster processing, and that time of processing goes down with the higher arrival rate.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that the probability of forking actually also goes up when you speed up the block arrival rate. Remember, we have the network delay. So within the network delay, so remember, so when Fahad and I were mining, we are mining at a faster rate, but our discoveries are falling within the network period, and we have, it creates havoc with our consensus time. That's what's going on.
I see, understand.
So that doesn't solve the problem. So the consensus time, of course, is part of the waiting time that the user has to suffer. So he gives up and he walks away from the system. That's what we're saying.
I see, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Kose. Last question, given that we are almost out of time, comes from Peter Zimmerman. He's asking, in the model, the benefit to using Bitcoin R is fixed. It seems more likely this might be increasing in the number of miners because a larger network is a more secure one. How do you think this would affect your results?
You know, that's a very good question. So as a matter of fact, I have this other paper where we are looking at heterogeneous benefits from doing transactions. You know, that's certainly an interesting question. So one thing I can say, this may not be quite what you had in mind, is that in such a model, the equilibrium is such that sort of a higher valued users are staying back on the system and they would want to adopt the system. So in fact, we see that already. If you look at transaction fees, the value of the transaction, that is it a $5 transaction or a $1,000 transaction, we are already seeing a migration towards the high value transactions on the blockchain. So that would be an interesting kind of avenue to explore. But in our model, so remember, in our model, we are focused on the sort of aversion to weighting. That is the heterogeneity in our model. But you know, we could study things like differential utility from these transactions. Yes.
Okay,
so.
Perfect. I think this is a very natural stopping time. We are out of, we're 1 minute late. Let me thank Kose for the great paper presentation. And let me thank also the audience for the great question. Please make sure to check our website and follow us on Twitter at GUFinPolicy. And I'd like to remind everybody that next week we're going to have Adair Morse, and her paper is going to be titled Footprints of Credit Risk and Algorithmic Accountability. And so I hope to see you next week. Thank you so much for logging in, and have a great weekend.
Thank you, Alberto, and thank you, Rina, for organizing this whole thing.
Thank you. Bye.